Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Browsers 3000 learning sessions. This is session number 2, I believe, that we have done. This is, again, if you weren't there for the opening summit, 6-week hackathon focused on learning, building, experimenting with browsers and decentralization. We're going to see a number of different projects, some building extensions, some building wallets, some building web APIs. But today we have a special guest. Mauve will talk to us about their project Agregore. I think maybe we met for the first time in person at dweb camp a few years ago. We got to hang out and talk about VR stuff for a while, which was fantastic. It was great to get to know you then. I'm really glad that you're coming and joining us for projects like this today. So without further ado, I will hand it off. Thanks so much for coming. And thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you, Dietrich. Hello. Thank you for taking the time to attend the learning session about Agregore. Hoping you're all having a good time at the hackathon and a good time in general. So today we're going to be making our first peer-to-peer website with Agregore. And to do this, we're going to learn a little bit about the peer-to-peer web, how it works. We're going to learn some basic HTML and CSS skills and some Chrome DevTools skills for modifying stuff on our page. Then we're going to put together our websites and we're going to show them off to each other by sharing links to our peer-to-peer websites in a hackmd. If you have any questions or get lost, feel free to post in the chat and we can make sure that we're all in sync. Most of the stuff I'm going to say is going to be in the speaker notes of the slideshow, which you can see by pressing P. And I've shared a hackmd in the Browsers 3000 channel and as well in the Zoom chats, which contains some resources and as well a link to the slides. So regardless of whether you're using the notes or not, I suggest you follow along with the slides so you can copy and paste code snippets where appropriate and backtrack to previous slides if you missed anything. So as Dietrich said, I'm Mauve or at Ranger Mauve anywhere on the internets. My pronouns are they, them, and I do consulting through my company Mauve Software Inc. As well, I am high-key obsessed with peer-to-peer and local first software. So before we get into Agregore, let's take a quick overview of how the peer-to-peer web works. So unlike the regular web, the peer-to-peer web doesn't use any central servers to distribute content. Content on the peer-to-peer web is just files and doesn't have any fancy backends or DevOps things to render and distribute content. Instead of having these files served from one location or some sort of cloud, they're exchanged person to person and from computer to computer directly. Unlike regular web apps, everything works offline by default and works over local networks without needing to use the internet. This means that if I am editing my website, I don't need to be connected to anything in order to load and update data. As well, if I've already downloaded some data, I can just view it. And as well, if I am on a local network with somebody, even if we don't have internet, we can just kind of connect to each other and exchange data. So imagine you're out camping somewhere and I can share an image with a friend or even share an entire application just by our computers connecting to each other and loading a hyperlink. So let's take a look at some of the peer-to-peer protocols that are supported in Agregore. So firstly, we have IPFS, which we all know and love, and it's probably the one everyone is most familiar with here. So it's really great for data that gets reused between websites and data that doesn't change too often. This is because it is content addressable, and content is deduplicated across all the peers on the network and is immutable. So that means if I have content that, like say a library or some images or videos that are shared between a lot of websites, the actual downloading happens in parallel for all websites at once. And that means that content is more available. However, this means that it's not as good for data that changes really fast. And as well with IPFS, a lot of the data that's actually published out there is essentially public. So you don't really want to put your passwords or like private photos unless you have an extra layer of encryption. Another protocol that Agregore supports is called Hypercore protocol. So unlike IPFS, it's not immutable or content addressable, and instead uses public-private key pairs to identify groups of files. So it's good for data that changes pretty often or is private by default. However, it's not really good for deduplicating content. And the ecosystem is not as far advanced as Filecoin with regards to Pinata and, sorry, did I say Filecoin? I meant IPFS, because IPFS has these cool things like Pinata, Filecoin, IPFS cluster, all of these cool things. Hypercore doesn't really have them yet. However, for today's session, I'm going to be using Hypermore because we're going to be doing a lot of updating of our websites. However, the APIs to use IPFS are essentially the same. So if afterwards you're interested in using IPFS only, I suggest looking at the Agregore website and the documentation. So as I mentioned, we're going to be using the peer-to-peer web. And I think the easiest way to interact with these peer-to-peer protocols is with a web browser that supports them out of the box. So I'd just like to take a moment to make sure we're all on the same page. And while I keep talking, let's go to this slide and go to the download link for Agregore. So as well, you're going to want to go to the releases page and download an installer that works for your system. So right now we support Windows, Mac, and Linux. So if you're on one of those OSs, you should be good to go. If you're using 32-bit Windows XP, sorry, I can't really do much there. Anyway, so while I keep going, I'd like you all to install Agregore if you haven't yet. So Agregore lets you talk to different peer-to-peer protocols using custom protocol schemes and get and post methods using the browser's fetch API. So what this means is that for those of you that have done web development with HTTP servers, the transition to peer-to-peer is pretty smooth. Instead of making a request to a server, you send a request to the protocol handler inside the browser. So whereas if I wanted to download some content over HTTP, I'd do a get for an HTTP URL to some file. Instead, now I do a get to a IPFS URL or a Hypercore URL or an IPNS URL or whatever else. And the browser can handle the exact same mechanisms for loading stuff. So anywhere where you could use an HTTP URL, you can basically use an IPFS URL or whatever else. As well with servers, if you want to upload data, you do a post with some content, and with the peer-to-peer stuff, you do the exact same thing. I can post to IPFS to upload some content to the peer-to-peer network, and that'll get distributed if I share the URL with anyone. So anyone having trouble installing so far? Great, not seeing anything yet. So keep going there, and I'm going to go over the HTML and CSS basics that will kind of get us acquainted with what we're doing today. If you've already done a lot of HTML and CSS, this probably won't be super interesting, but for those that are new to development, this will just kind of give you a brief overview. So all websites are made out of three basic parts: HTML for the general structure and textual content, CSS for styling that structure, and JavaScript for making these websites interactive. However, JavaScript is mostly optional if you just want to put something static on the web. So we're going to pretty much gloss over it. We're going to do a little bit of JavaScript just to save our pages, but mostly we're going to focus on the HTML and CSS because honestly, I think that's the most fun with regards to just putting content on the web. In fact, HTML is all you really need for basic documents where you just want text on a page. I'm going to be going over some examples of HTML snippets next, and I'm going to explain the different parts. Don't worry about running these snippets anywhere yet. It's mostly just to give people a feel for them. So over here, we have an HTML file. So this is a valid HTML page. All web pages are just text under the hood. There's no fancy file formats, like binary file formats. It's not like an image. You can open any web page and pretty much read it with your eyes, unless it's super messy, which it often is. So let's go over this line by line and see what everything means. So the first line here is what's called the doc type. This is important to let the browser know that you are actually loading an HTML page and that it's using a recent version of HTML. So there's a bunch of different doc types, but lately the only one you really need to know is doc type HTML. This is kind of a holdover from some legacy things that got to the web where it is now. And before this line of text was actually very, very long and very, very complicated. So luckily, it's not anymore. We don't have to care. Next, the most important part, I think, of any web page is actually the title. So titles on a web page is what helps you kind of differentiate between them. This is what makes it easy for you to recall them in your history, to differentiate them in your browser tabs, to just kind of like to help with search engines if you don't want to do any other SEO. And so it's really good to have a title that makes sense for what your content is, that'll be memorable and kind of usable. So let's just quickly talk about this structure here. So all HTML consists of these things called elements, which are names of element types surrounded by less than and greater than signs, followed by a less than sign and a slash. So this kind of opens the element and this closes the element. This is what lets us define all of the different boxes and buttons and images and stuff that you see on the screen. So there's a bunch of HTML tags which are built into the browser, which let you do different things and have different semantic meanings. We're not going to go too deep into that, but if you look in the hackmd, I've linked to the Mozilla Developer Center documentation for learning HTML. And so there's some useful resources there if you're interested in more details. Over here, we have our first visual element. So the doc type is something that just lets the browser know what it's parsing. This title is also metadata that lets the browser know what the title for the page is. But this H1 element is a header element, which means it'll be nice and bold on your screen. And we'll see that in just a bit. So next, let's look at a bit of HTML with some inline CSS. So CSS is how we actually shape all of these elements on the screen. So here we have the doc type and the title that we saw before, but now we have a new element called a div. Divs are basically your like generic element where if you don't know what to put in there, you just use a div. And here we gave it a style attribute, which you can just copy paste. But here it defines all of the different stylings that we want for this element. So we want it to be position fixed. That means fixed relative to the entire page. We want it to be 10 units from the top and 10 units from the left. As well, we want to give it a height of 80% of the screen and a width of 80% and background of red. So that's a lot of stuff, but the format of CSS is this general thing where you have a key, which is some sort of name for the style, and you have a value, which is the actual thing you want that style to be. So here we have an example of CSS units. So there's a bunch of different ways you can specify sizes and distances on a screen. One of them is pixels. Another one is font size, which is EM. But I like to use this one called vmin, which basically says a percentage of either the width or the height, whichever one is smallest. So it might sound a little complicated, but once we get into the visuals, it should be easy enough to understand. And as well, colors can be represented in different ways. We'll go over them in a bit. But if you want to make a color and you don't want to think too much about it, you can type most things like, say, mauve or purple or green, and they'll just accept them. Again, I linked to the CSS reference in the hackmd, which here, let me just repost that in the chat. And there's more information there, but we'll go over some basics in a sec. Cool. So questions so far. Is anybody having trouble installing Agregore? Does anyone have questions about HTML or CSS or stuff that I didn't think of? I'm going to give it a few seconds. And yeah, feel free to either post on Discord or in the chat. And I think YouTube is like 30 seconds in the past. So if you post your comments there, I might take a while to actually see them. Ah, yes, useful comment from Dietrich for macOS. You need to approve running it in the security and privacy settings pane. So Agregore is currently a one-person operation, and getting all of the signing certificates and making corporations happy is a bunch of effort. So sadly, you're going to have to trust me and mitigate or work around some security stuff. Okay, cool. So I'm going to assume that everyone that wants to install Agregore has installed it now. And oh, yeah, there's a question in the chat. Is it Electron based? So yeah, Agregore is actually built on top of the Electron.js framework. And that's because Electron gives us a lot of power that is hard to get in different places. So for example, it gives us, of course, the framework to create browser windows and to control content in it. It also gives us Node.js integration, which some of the protocols require to run. In fact, Agregore bundles a JS IPFS node and the JavaScript version of Hypercore protocol and all the other protocols in the browser itself using Electron. But one of the most important things that Electron gives us that nobody else has is the actual APIs for registering protocol handlers. So as you may notice in my URL here, I can set the URL to hyper, and then that'll let me load some custom logic to actually load the Hypercore protocol. This is something you can't do out of the box in web browsers yet. Luckily, Agalia and Protocol Labs are making really great strides in making it possible to register custom protocol handlers. But at the moment, Electron is the easiest way to just put something together and distribute it out. I am looking into alternatives, particularly, I think there's this one Rust framework where they're kind of like making progress, which should improve performance. But right now, Electron is just kind of the easiest way to go. Okay, cool. Oh, wondering how the protocols work actually, and are there special browser APIs also? So we're actually going to get into that in detail in just a second. But the TLDR is that everywhere where you can use fetch and get for an HTTP server, you can instead use IPFS. And the APIs for interacting with the different protocols are all inside theirs. There's no custom JavaScript APIs being injected into the page. It's all just existing web APIs. And a lot of your tools that already work with HTTP and fetch should actually translate really well to IPFS and the such. Cool. So now that we have our browser installed, let's create our first peer-to-peer website. So making a website in Agregore is super simple. We're going to open up a new window, and we're going to navigate to hyper://blog. In fact, if you click this link in the slides, it should go right to it. So I'm going to click the link, and bam, I just made a new peer-to-peer website, in this case using the Hypercore protocol. So what happens here is I'm using the name portion to generate a custom public-private key pair that's specific to my computer. So even though we're all navigating to blog, we're all generating our own websites that are just kind of like using the name blog as a shortcut. This is similar to how the IPFS API has a key management interface where you can give names to keys when you generate them. And it just kind of makes managing them easier in your application because you don't have to like save your private key to local storage or anything like that. So in fact, if we open up the DevTools, we can see where the actual public URL is. But we'll get to that in a second. So, so as I mentioned, our next step is going to be opening up Chrome DevTools. So if you're working with the web, this is kind of like the most invaluable tool, in my opinion. You know, a lot of people like their IDEs with like their Visual Studios and their Emacs or whatever it is the cool kids use. But if you want to actually debug stuff on a web page, DevTools is kind of the way to go. And so one way to open it is to hit Control-Shift-I, or I think Command-Shift-I on Mac. Or if that doesn't work, you can right-click. I don't know if the right-click is visible on Zoom, and click Inspect. Alternately, you can hit Alt to open up this little window up here, and then go under File and open DevTools. So what that'll do is open these DevTools down here. And this is what we're going to be using to actually interact with our web page. So we're not going to be installing any extra software, any extra IDs. We're going to be doing everything in DevTools. Cool. So the first thing we're going to do is actually see how do we interact with these APIs. So if you want to load a file, you can just use the browser's fetch API with a particular URL. So what we're going to do is copy all of this text, open the DevTools, and I'm going to just clear all that stuff, and we're going to paste it. And bam, if everything worked out, you should be getting a copy of my blog's homepage on your terminal. And so what we're doing here is we're fetching from the URL, and we're getting the text out of the response and logging it to the console. So we can also do that for, say, the IPFS homepage. So if we do IPNS:/ or let me just get, I forgot to get IPFS companion running. Live demos and workshops are a thing. All right, excellent. So what we can do is actually, instead of using the hyper URL, we can use IPNS, and we can actually get the homepage of IPFS. So it might take a little bit longer to execute because we need to do the lookup for IPNS, but here we have the homepage. And so with this, any IPFS, IPNS, or hyper URL, they're all available through the same interface. So that means anywhere where you're trying to load content on the web, it doesn't matter where that content is coming from anymore, and you don't need to do any extra coercing to make it work. So say you're loading 3D models or videos, or say you're loading code from the web, rather than having to inject a bunch of JavaScript APIs and like use these like globals that are coming out of nowhere to fetch the data and like having custom logic everywhere, you can just use fetch or anything that uses fetch. Cool. So that was downloading a file. Next, we're going to upload our first file to Hyper. So again, we're going to be copy pasting this, and we'll take a look at what it does in a sec. But we're using the fetch API. But this time, rather than fetching a file that exists, we're going to specify a file that we want to exist. So I want to add a file called index.html to my blog, and I want it to have the following content. So to do that, we're going to change the HTTP method to put, and we're going to set a body for the request for some sort of content. Again, we're going to have the doc type, and here's where I'm going to want you folks to customize stuff a little bit. We're going to want to change the title to be something that reflects us. So let me open up the DevTools again, and I am going to, did I see a message? No, perfect. I'm going to enter or copy paste that code, and I'm going to change the title to Mauve's blog, and then maybe a purple heart emoji. And over here, I have a script tag. This is just going to inject some useful code onto your pages so that rather than having to do this dance of opening the console and like uploading files individually, you'll be able to just drag and drop files into the blog, and that'll just automatically upload them to it. This will just make life a little bit easier. As well, it'll inject some global functions that'll let us save our current page after we've edited it in the DevTools. And as well, you're probably going to want to modify that header to say something that reflects who you are. So like, hello, I am Mauve. I like cats, and I have a pet snake. And let's add a snake emoji. In fact, let's do a bunch. All right, cool. So once you're happy with the content of your website, we're going to hit enter. And bam, we just created our first web page. So we're going to copy that URL from fetch, and we're going to paste it in our browser. So as you can see, here is my web page. Here's all of my little like snake emojis. And if we open up the DevTools, we can actually see the HTML. So for example, if I want to change the text, I can click on the text and change it to whatever else I want. And so we'll get into how we save the changes in a sec. But there we go. That should be the start. So before we keep going, has anyone had trouble getting up to here? Is everyone on their first page? I'm going to give it a few seconds. Yeah, question in the chat. Can you explain what Hyper is? So let's just go back real quick. So we have the IPFS protocol. Hypercore protocol is just kind of another thing. It's kind of like IPFS, but one of the differences is it's not as good for deduplicating content. The ecosystem isn't as far, but it's useful when you have more private content where stuff changes really often. Because with Hyper, unless you share the URL to folks, or with Hypercore protocol, I should say, unless you share the URL of your website with somebody, there's no way they can download it, even if they're scraping through your connections. And as well, it's just easy to quickly update stuff. Eventually, I'm hoping that the IPNS interface in Agregore will get easy enough to use that we can just do that. But there's going to need to be a little bit of work around specifying stuff like writable gateways, which is a bit of a to-do right now. Question in the chat. So when we use Hyper, we aren't creating a public web page, it's just private. Pretty much, yes. So when you use Hyper, by default, it's private in that nobody can access it. but you can make it public by sharing it with people. So in the hackmd that I pasted in the chat earlier, which I shall repaste in case anyone is missing it, we have a section called websites. And at the end, we're going to be pasting our websites there if we want and doing a little showcase. And so that's how you share things. IPFS is similar in that even though technically people could like scrape for content hashes and like all of this hacker stuff, generally, if you don't share your content hash with people, it's going to be pretty much private. But it's like a subtle distinction. The main thing is the mutability is going to be easier right now. I love IPFS. Okay, cool. I don't see any questions about the fetch stuff so far. So what we're going to do now is make our blog actually interesting by getting some GIFs onto it. So we're going to go to GIF cities, which is a thing made by the Internet Archive. And so what this is going to give us is a vast repository of super cool bling, which we're going to be making use of. So I'm just going to change the screen share to be my full screen for a second. And I'm going to show you all how to upload stuff to your website. So the first thing we're going to do is open up GIF cities. I'm just going to paste that in the chat. There is a link in the slides though. And we're going to search for something cool. I'm going to search for cats because I enjoy cats. And we're also going to want to get our file explorer open because we're going to want to drag stuff to a folder before we drag it to our website. This is a bit of a workaround we need to do because browser security doesn't let me download a GIF directly from website into another, sadly, yet. Anyways, so I've searched for cats and now I'm going to go and look through and find some cool chonkers. So I really like this cat. I'm just going to drag it into my finder there. I really like this cat. And I think this one is pretty neat. So once you have your cats, you're going to want to open up your website again. So if you forgot the URL, you can open up the link over here. And now to add a file, all I got to do is I'm just going to open the console so we can see where we are, is drag an image if everything worked. Oh my gosh. Is everything working? Let's see. All right, I think the demo gods might be frowning on me because what should have happened is when I dragged the GIF on there, it should just, oh, okay, yeah, poof. So the problem was that I needed to drag the cat right over the text on the screen because browser quirks. But what should happen is we have the image is now uploaded and it actually should have added it directly to the page, which it's not. But that is okay because we have workarounds. Okay, so since the demo gods have frowned upon me, what we're going to be doing is manually adding the image to the site. So as you might have noticed in the console, after you dragged your cats or whatever onto the screen, it had some logs saying that it was uploading. So what it was doing was actually uploading the image to this folder called assets. And so in here, we can see all of the cats we've uploaded. So if I go back here and I drag and drop a few more cats, and maybe this one too, and upload, yep. They're all uploaded. If you go back to the assets folder, we should see all of our cats here. So I'm just going to go back to my console and show the blog. And I'm going to be showing you how to edit the HTML on your website to actually show your cats. So first thing we're going to want to do is right-click one of these GIFs and copy the link address. So this will let us link directly to the cat. Alternately, you can click on the GIF and just copy paste the URL. And then we're going to want to go back to our blog. So next, we're going to want to open up our console again. And oh my. Okay, so it actually tried to add images, but there is a bug in the code. Life is hard. So what we're going to want to do is click on our image attributes that should have been added. And we're going to click on Add Attribute. So that's going to let us edit some stuff. And we're going to want to paste src equals, and then that link we had before. And so that's going to give us our cat. So again, you're going to want to open DevTools, either Control-Shift-I or clicking Inspect. You're going to want to either edit an existing image or just paste one in. I'm going to show an example of the text in chat. Oops. And we're going to set the source. Any questions about this so far? Because I'm guessing I probably lost some folks. Meantime, I'm just going to, feel free to. So question in the chat is, how can we delete images from the HTML? So what we're going to do is open up the blog and again, open up the DevTools. And if you want to delete something, you just go over the thing you want to delete, right-click it, and hit Delete Element. Alternately, you can select it and hit the Delete key on your keyboard. So another question in the chat, what is the host for the GIF? Is it your local machine? And the answer is yes. So what's happening is you have a Hypercore protocol or IPFS node running directly on your machine. And when you upload files to it, it's being uploaded to the protocol on your machine. So it's advertising, excuse me, on the network if someone wants to actually download it peer-to-peer. But as I mentioned before, with the peer-to-peer web, everything is local first and offline first. So any changes you do are local, but then they can be exchanged peer-to-peer, which we'll be doing soon. And speaking of things I mentioned earlier, I said that you can just kind of edit the src and add a cat in there. But I actually neglected to mention another part, which is that even though we can add the image, if we refresh, suddenly it's not there. And so what, oh, sorry, before I go on that, there's another question in the chat. Is that true even if your src points to an image hosted elsewhere? In that case, no. So the only time it's actually using the peer-to-peer protocols is if you're using a peer-to-peer URL. So if you're using an IPFS URL, it's loading it locally. If you're uploading to IPFS, it's also loading it locally. And if you're pointing to an HTTP URL or an HTTPS URL or Gemini or whatever else, that's actually going to be loaded over those protocols from the internet. So that's going to be cached in your browser as it normally would be, but it's not going to be offline first because only the peer-to-peer protocols themselves are offline first. So just to go back to the slides. So what we're going to want to do is actually learn about saving. So, oh, I don't know what just happened. Ah, perfect. So what I mentioned before, we have images. I'm just going to show you how to actually place and resize an image. And then we're going to go into how to actually save the image on the screen. So if I go back to the blog and edit the image. So I'm going to right click, edit as HTML, and paste my image in. So what I'm going to do next is actually resize the image. So if we look at the slide I just had, we can go into the element.style section here, and we can add some CSS to actually change things. So I'm going to select the image, then I'm going to click on the element.style, and I'm going to give it a width of 50 vmin. And so what this will do is give it a width that is 50% of whatever the lowest value is. So now as I kind of like drag the dev tools up and down, you can see it gets bigger or smaller. And so this lets our web pages look similar regardless of our screen size. So finally, I mentioned we're going to learn how to save. And as I said before, we're embedding some helper scripts onto all of our web pages, which are going to give us a function called save in our console. And so that's actually going to save the changes we did to the web page. So whenever you want to save, you can call await save in your console. That'll run for a few milliseconds. And now if I refresh the page a bunch of times, it's going to retain my changes. So say I change the background of the whole page to background green, and I call save, that'll now persist. Cool. So let's go into some more styling just to shake things up. We're going to look at positioning the images on the screen. So there is a style called position fixed, which, as I mentioned before, kind of places it somewhere relevant to the screen itself. So we're going to go back to our cats, and we're going to give it some more style, saying position fixed. And I'm going to say it's going to be 1 vmin from the bottom and 1 vmin from the right. Vmin, bam. And so I'm going to save that. So you can also play around with this. Like say you want it to be 50% from the right, you can specify 50 VW, which is width. Or you can have a specific number of pixels, like say 420 px from the right. And so this will be responsive as your viewport changes. Cool. So I'm going to save that as well. As well, we're going to want to maybe do some advanced styling, where if we specify a different width and height, it might look a little funky. So I'm going to copy paste the CSS from here. And I'm going to go back to my cat and inspect it. I'm going to replace its CSS style with the stuff I copy pasted. And so that'll make sure that it's always in the middle of the screen and scales no matter how it looks. So there's some fancy CSS in here. I'm not going to get into it too much. But at this point, I'd like to encourage folks to add some more images and just kind of mess with their blog a bit more. So if you have any questions about what we have so far, post them in the chat. And in the meantime, I suggest we all take a few minutes just to add some cats on our page or add some content. If you are already pretty well versed in CSS and HTML, you can probably do some fancier things than I can. Cover. Okay, cool. So we're going to take a few minutes just to customize our websites. And feel free to post questions in the chat. So I'm going to, first of all, change the color of my whole web page because green is not my favorite. I'm going to go into this little color wheel picker, make it a nice purple color. I'm going to save that. And I'm going to go back to my assets folder. And I'm going to copy another cat and just add it to the screen. src again, and then the URL of the cat. And in fact, what I'm going to do is just add a bunch of these. I selected the element, hit copy, hit body, and then I'm just going to paste a bunch of these cats. I'm just going to edit the body as HTML and just copy paste. All right, let's see how that looks. Excellent. I'm going to add maybe we're going to use some old school HTML using the marquee element. So again, we're going to edit the screen or edit the page. And we're going to add this HTML element called marquee. I'm going to close the marquee tag here. And what this is going to do is it's going to animate all of our cats in a line. So questions, what happens if you use a relative URL like /assets/cat.gif? Does it default to HTTP? And the answer is no, it doesn't. It behaves just like regular URLs. So if I edit the attribute and let me edit it. If I get rid of the hyper/blog or whatever, it works exactly as before. So if I save and refresh, it's exactly the same. All right, so we're getting towards the end. So hopefully y'all have put at least something on your screen to start. And we're gonna get to the next part, which is actually sharing our websites with each other. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna get the public URL of our browser or of our website. So we had this local URL, which is hyper://blog, excuse me. But that is something we can't really share to somebody because that'll just create a website on their end. So what we're going to do is get the public URL. So there's two ways to do that. So first, you're going to want to go back to your blog and then open up the dev tools using Control-Shift-I. So I added some helper scripts to make life easier. So if you use the await get public URL function, I'm just gonna, you can copy paste that either from the slides or I'm pasting it in the Zoom chat, or you can copy it from my screen. If you invoke that, you're actually going to get back this long string. And so what we're gonna do is copy that link address and paste it. And so now this is using the full URL. So if you're using IPFS, this will be the multi-hash of the, or sorry, the CID, content ID of your web page, or the CID of the public key of your IPNS domain, whatever else. And in Hypercore protocol, this is the 32 bits or 32-byte hex encoded public key. So the URLs look super ugly, but this is because they are unique globally and totally offline. Cool. So just to recap again, you open up the DevTools and invoke get public URL, and then copy that link. So what I'm going to want folks to do now, if they want, is to open up the hackmd or paste in the chat and go down to the websites section and post your URLs so that we can showcase them on the stream. Oh, so, oh, yeah, it's going to look ugly as heck, but feel free to just paste your URLs down there. So I'm going to open up one of the ones here on the stream. I'm just going to paste it right into Agregore, and bam, hey, it's sticky keys. Hey, sticky keys. So we can see your HTML here. I see you linked directly to an image, which is totally valid. And we can kind of see how they've just got this basic HTML page with the stuff we had before. So as you can see, that loaded super fast, and that was all without any central servers or any caching servers or anything else in between us. And we didn't need to register for a domain name. We didn't really need to do anything, just kind of exchange URLs with each other. And so our computers found each other over the peer-to-peer network, and we connected directly to each other, and I downloaded their website. So we also have another website over here. Let's check that out. So this one took also about a second to load. My name is Stoyan, and I like owls. I like owls too. They're really great. Oh, and the image took a little bit to load. Let's see what's over there. We have this cartoon owl.gif. Let me try refreshing. It seems, oh, it's just taking a while to download. What? 404. Not found. I don't know why it's 404ing. As you can see, not everything works all the time. But hopefully some folks were able to load my website as well. And I think that's all the folks that wanted to share their websites for today. But that's kind of how it works. You can just edit stuff directly in Agregore. You can add code, you can link to things, you can link to each other. In fact, if I copy the URL from this person, I can add it to my blog as well by just changing the URL. So with this, we can actually link between protocols, mixing HTTP, IPFS, Hyper, Gemini, BitTorrent, everything that you can think of, and using whatever makes sense in whatever situations or whatever people feel like using. Yeah, so hopefully that was useful, and we're just gonna do some last thoughts, and then we'll talk about the rest. So hopefully this was a fun introduction to the peer-to-peer web and making your first website. Hopefully folks that are following the recording after the fact will be able to use this to also experiment. Feel free to ping me on the IPFS Discord in the Browsers 3000 chat if you are building something with Agregore or want to or have questions. It'd be cool if even after this, people could tweet some of their URLs at me so that I could save them or reshare them with folks. If you're interested in doing more advanced things, like say you're already a seasoned developer, I suggest digging into the helpers.js function and looking into the Agregore documentation and seeing how it all works. It should be pretty similar to other web stuff you've done in the past. And honestly, I hope this will inspire some folks to try to make stuff and to think about alternative ways we can interact with the web that's more local, more resilient, and more accessible to people. Accessible in terms of easier to use, but also accessible because you got to remember accessibility. All right, so I'm going to answer some of the questions in the chat. So one question, how does it decide which protocol to use in the relative URL example? So the way relative URLs work in the browser is it's always relative to the current origin. So if I do a new URL /example.txt relative to the current URL, it'll always be .href. Bam. It'll always just give me relative to wherever I am. So if I go to say ipfs.io and I loaded it over HTTPS, it'll give me relative to what the global thing is. Similarly with IPNS, it'll also load it relative to the domain. So it's exactly the same as it would with HTTP URLs. Another question is how to get public URL of image. So one way to do that is if you go to your blog. Let me just open the blog. And you're going to want to first navigate to your public URL. So await get public URL. So copy that link and navigate to it. And so now if you if you right click any of your images and copy the source address, oh wow. Since I did okay, that was a really good catch because since I was using absolute URLs instead of relative URLs, it is actually broken. So if we look in here, this cat is relative. So if I right click it and do copy source address, I get an address relative to, I don't know what I just did there. I'll get an address relative to it. But if I right click these guys that are absolute URLs, that's not going to give me the right one. So I guess one thing you're going to want to do is relative URLs. But outside that, right clicking and copying should work if you're navigating to the public URL. Comment in the chat. Curious, I can't seem to load IPNS portal.thedisco.zone or IPNS chat.thedisco.zone. Does Agregore support subdomains over IPNS? So that's actually a bit of a question mark because Agregore has different ways of interacting with, oh, I can't copy paste out of Zoom. Let's just put an app. Navigate manually IPNS:// the portal.thedisco.zone. So IPFS support Agregore is using JS IPFS. And sadly, I think that isn't as stable as Go IPFS for IPNS. So one thing I'm working on this summer is to actually replace JS IPFS with Go IPFS in Agregore. And so that should support all of the subdomains and all of that stuff better. So at the moment, DNS link mostly works. IPNS using public keys mostly works. It all works better if you have IPFS companion loaded locally, but it can be a little iffy just because IPNS is, it works a little differently between JavaScript and Go. Cool. Yeah, so I guess that's probably time. Or do I have time for more questions, or are there more questions, Dietrich?
We are at time, but you are free to continue answering questions, I think, if there are more.
Sweet, thanks. So I see there's a question, do you have recommended peer-to-peer host for web hyper websites? So one of the things that's great about IPFS is the ecosystem is really solid for keeping content online. So you've got the IPFS pinning APIs, you've got the pinning services API so that you can talk to things like Pinata or stuff in the cloud. And you've got Filecoin, which lets you just like use this distributed network to keep stuff online, which is great. However, for Hyper, it's a little more obscure and we don't have as many fancy things. So personally, I use this thing called DAT Store, which is a command line utility that I use to keep stuff online. So I usually just launch this in a DigitalOcean droplets. And this also comes with a CLI that lets me talk to either a local instance or a remote one. And so this lets me either sync folders to Hypercore or just keep Hypercores pinned either in the cloud or locally. So this is what I usually use. It's not as fancy, but it works. All right, cool. I think that's probably all the questions. Thank you all so much for coming. And yeah, again, hopefully you can make something cool with this. If you have any comments or want to follow up or whatever else, I'm pretty online. So you can either tweet at me on the tweeters or mention me in the IPFS Discord or join the Agregore Discord if you want to kind of keep in touch. So thank you. And I guess I'll pass it off to Dietrich.
No, thank you. That was awesome. It was great to be able to see the how Agregore works and how a multi-protocol browser can work, which I like aside from just HTTP, right? So it's very cool, and also a great view into the differences between some of the protocols. And relative links strike again. The bane of every decentralized web developer's life. We'll get there eventually.
Hopefully.
But thanks for joining. And like Mauve said, ask questions in the channel. Come join the Browser 3000 Discord. We're all hanging out there and interested to see what you're building, how you're building it, and any challenges. We're there to learn and build and experiment together. So thanks for joining, everyone.